morning, everyone.
Morning.
Thank you for coming out. Today's coffee talk is going to share stories of murder and mayhem from Pipestone County a long time ago. I've shared some of these, or all of these stories actually, in January and February at events we're calling History Happy Hour. So I've talked about them at Stacy's Bar and Grill in Woodstock and also at the Country Club. There will be one more of these events next week. Sorry, I'm not pre-sharing that story, but I am sharing the ones that I have shared in the past. So we've had some members that are probably watching this up on YouTube as soon as we get it loaded that have requested to know these stories. So I thought it'd be a great way to make sure that even more people know some of the things that happen in Pipestone County. For me, these stories kind of indicate that society is the same as it always has been. If we think back to biblical times and Cain and Abel, we know that society has people that do things that aren't, within the scope of the law. And so things have not changed or gotten worse. They're just stories of people. So my first story, come on, sorry. Better get it to want to click to the next slide. There we go. Case number 1 is the story of the murder of Maggie Dowd that happened in June of 1900. But before we can talk about Maggie, we actually need to go a little farther back. And if we go back to April of 1885, we learn about a man by the name of James Dowd. He arrived at Pipestone and he bought 320 acres of land in Sweet Township, which is near the South Dakota border. This is a plat map from 1898. The larger one shows you the image of where it was. Pipestone's located up at the top, so you can see it was southwest of Pipestone. And then enlarged is his name. And in the circle I have marked, it says German Evangelical Lutheran Church Cemetery. That is the church that was known for many years as the Salem EUB Church. Then it was the Salem United Methodist Church. It currently is still operating. It operates as the Salem Church and it's non-denominational. And it actually is the church my family attends, which is how I kind of first heard about this story of this murder that had happened out in that area. And it made me want to go and do a little investigating of what happened. So James arrives in Pipestone County in 1885, and for the next 10 years he shows up periodically throughout the newspaper as being the successful farmer. He's diversified. He's growing oats and wheat and barley and flax. He's raising cattle. He's also raising horses, work horses that he is selling to farmers around the area. He married Margaret McGaw, Maggie, in September of 1897. They lived on his farm on the edge of Pipestone, Minnesota, really, just before you cross over into South Dakota. And a year later, in 1898, the couple's child, their daughter Mary Jane, was born. Shortly after Mary Jane was born, James became ill, and he passed away one day before Mary Jane turned a year old in 1899. His dying wish was to be buried at at a Catholic cemetery, and because Pipestone did not have a Catholic cemetery established yet, he was buried at what they now call the Old Catholic Cemetery because they have a new cemetery. And this is an image of James's gravestone. Maggie had family in the area. Her uncle was Fraser McKay. He was a businessman here in Pipestone. He owned a building on Pipestone's Main Street. Those of you that are from Pipestone or do any shopping in Pipestone, if you've ever visited the Clothier by Dawn, that was Fraser's building. He operated the Gem Theater from that building. But though she had family here, Maggie chose to stay on the farm. And in staying on the farm, she made that conscious choice that to run a farm, she was going to need help. So she relied heavily on hired men. One of those hired men was a man by the name of Peter Swenson. He became infatuated with Maggie. She denied him, and it led to the point that he actually left her employment and took a job here in Pipestone working as a stonemason in a quarry. Now, Peter, a lot of this is somewhat speculative, but also based on newspaper accounts. On June 30th, a year after James's death, Peter Swenson was seen in Pipestone purchasing a revolver from a local hardware store. He was then seen riding southwest out of Pipestone in the general direction of Maggie's farm. We don't know what time he arrived. What we do know is that a day later, Maggie's body was found dead on the door of her home in a pool of blood. Now, evidence seemed to indicate that he had arrived sometime in the evening or overnight hours and that he had called to her from the road. What's that evidence? Maggie had hastily dressed and was still wearing part of her night clothes, and little Mary Jane, the daughter, was also dressed in pajamas, indicating that he had arrived at the house after bedtime or near bedtime. We also believe she was called to the road because he shot her, and the trail of blood leading back to the house indicated that it had not happened in the home. So he called her out. We don't know. It's speculative that perhaps he, once again, had proposed marriage or made his intentions of wanting to court her known, and she had denied him. But no matter what happened, we know that Maggie was shot. The bullet passed through her neck. Now, from the indications, she must have been holding Mary Jane on her hip. And if you think about a mother holding a daughter, the little girl must have wrapped her arm around Maggie's neck. Because when Maggie's body was found, she not only had been shot through the neck, little Mary Jane had a bullet wound through her arm herself. Maggie must have turned and fled. Again, the blood trail told the people that were, the authorities that were investigating what had happened. And she made it back as far as their home before she collapsed inside the door. And it was presumed she bled to death because she was found in a pool of her own blood. How was she found? Her uncle went to the farm the very next day. It was Sunday. His intention was to take Maggie and Mary Jane back to Pipestone to spend the day. He found the scene. He went back to Pipestone with the little girl and alerted the authorities. The coroner impaneled a jury, which was simply neighbors from the area, and they looked at the scene and they all agreed that Maggie had died from a gunshot wound that she had not inflicted upon herself. And immediately these neighbors who knew Maggie and probably knew that Peter Swenson had been infatuated with her named Peter as a possible suspect. The Pipestone County authorities put a $400 reward up for the capture of Peter Swenson. And Fraser McKay, her uncle, matched it with another $100, making a $500 bounty on Peter Swenson's head. 2 days later, on Monday, Peter Swenson was located at the home of his brothers, Ole and Hans Swenson, near Woodstock. They arrested him. When they arrested him, he was found with strychnine in his pocket. He was put in a jail cell at Pipestone. I might mention that the jail in 1900 at Pipestone was housed in City Hall, which is the building we're sitting in now. The museum was the first City Hall, and the first jail before they built the first freestanding was within our building. Maggie's funeral was held on Wednesday. It was conducted from the Presbyterian Church, and she was buried at the Pipestone Cemetery, the one we call Old Woodlawn now, not the Catholic cemetery where her husband was buried. For a long time, we questioned why wasn't she buried with her husband, but we've come to the realization that it's probably because James was Catholic and he could be buried in a Catholic cemetery. But in 1900, if you weren't Catholic, it's not likely you were being buried in a Catholic cemetery. So quite likely she wasn't buried beside her husband because she was not Catholic herself. On Friday morning, Paul Ewart, a local attorney who had been assigned to Peter's case, arrived at the jail to interview him ahead of a court case. He was allowed to go back to the jail cell. And when he did, what he found was that Mr. Swenson had used his own suspenders and hung himself from his jail cell. Now, headlines, if you look at the top one, a foul murder and a suicidal confession, generally like to indicate that because he committed suicide, he had admitted his guilt. I don't know that that is the case, but that was the general belief. Nobody else was ever pursued as a possible suspect, and so it has gone down in history as Peter was the individual that murdered Maggie. His remains were turned over to his brothers, and he was buried at the Pipestone Cemetery the next day. Now, here's the ironic part. This is Old Woodlawn Cemetery. In the forefront is Maggie Dowd's gravestone. The one in the background is Peter Swenson's. He was buried right behind her. Her uncle, Fraser McKay, was in charge of settling the estate. Little Mary Jane went to live with cousins in Iowa, and then eventually they moved to California. She never returned to Pipestone. A year after the murder, the estate was settled, and it was her uncle Fraser McCain that bought the gravestones that were placed on her husband James's grave at Flandreau and on Maggie's. So they have identical stones, even though they are not buried together. And that's the story of the tragic death of Maggie Dowd. We also have other stories. There's the case of Roy Hislop, who died in August of 1891. This newspaper clipping from the Pipestone County Star on August 28th of 1891 reads, "A number of youths had a set to while watering trees on the courthouse grounds last Friday afternoon, and during the melee, Roy Hislop, a 10-year-old lad of this city, was badly pounded, and for several days his life was despaired of. He is some better at this writing, however, although the attending physician says he is by no means out of danger. Should the case prove fatal, the boys engaged in the row will stand a good chance of being severely punished for their folly." 10-year-old boy attacked on the courthouse lawn by other boys. That's the first we know about it. Unfortunately, 3 weeks later, there's the article that reports that Robert Roy Hislop, the 11-year-old son of Mr. and Mrs. R. Hislop of this city, who was so roughly handled by his schoolmates on the courthouse grounds a couple of weeks ago, died on Wednesday night after having suffered terribly ever since the day he was injured. Funeral services will be held at the Presbyterian Church this morning at 10 o'clock with the Reverend Lowe officiating. He's died. A week later, we get the story of his funeral. It tells us that it took place at the Presbyterian Church. It also tells us that Mr. Hislop, his father, has consulted legal advice in the matter and that Pipestone may be represented in the state reform school. So there is some public opinion saying that the guilty boys need to be punished, and one possible punishment that they might like to see perpetrated to these boys is that they go to the state reform school. We don't know who these boys are at this time. It's been almost a month from the time he was attacked to his death to his funeral. But a week later, on October 2nd of 1891, suddenly there's an article that tells us who these boys were. And it says, Miles and James Rourke and Earl Walkup were arrested last Saturday on the charge of assault and battery that resulted in the death of Roy Hislop. After a preliminary hearing before Judge Hitchcock's, the trio was discharged. The two younger boys on the evidence of two parties who swore that the youths were incompetent under the law to commit such an offense, and the older one because there was no evidence which showed he committed the crime. There was only one eyewitness to the fight, which resulted in Roy's death, and that lady was so far away that she was unable to recognize the boys who participated in the row. So she couldn't positively ID. We don't know where these names come from. Did Roy name them before his death? Perhaps, but they might have appeared in the papers sooner had he done so. Did the lady who was the witness name these boys as the possible suspects? Perhaps, and then upon questioning, it was learned that, well, she thought that's who it was. We can't be 100% sure of it. And so no punishment ever happened to these boys. But the rest of the story, so to speak, if you remember Paul Harvey's The Rest of the Story, there are a few interesting facts that make me go right back to my statement about the more things change, the more they stay the same. There is some evidence that indicates perhaps it was exactly as the article says. She couldn't positively ID, so there's not enough evidence to do any punishment to these boys. But we do find some evidence. When we look at the 1895 Minnesota State Census from Pipestone, circled you see the name Earl Walkup. If you remember, he was one of the boys that was listed as a possible suspect. At the top of this clipping is his father, Clarence Walkup. And if you'll notice what I have circled, I've circled his profession. Clarence Walkup was the marshal of Pipestone at the time, meaning the police officer at the time. But the case grows a little bit more questionable in my mind because I also located the article that you see over there from the Pipestone County Star. Before the event ever happened, on the 31st of July in 1891, E.L. Rourke, one of the first commissioners of the county, appeared before the county board on Friday and gave them a scolding, basically. He was saying that the land was donated for the courthouse, and it was. And it came with stipulations that the land be cared for because the courthouse had not yet been built. And he was calling out the county for not doing it. And after that scolding, they put water in, and the trees would be kept watered in order to fulfill that requirement from that deeded land or that donated land. So that was Mr. E.L. Rourke that complained in July. And by August, boys are watering the trees on the courthouse lawn. So his complaint has certainly come to pass. It's been recognized and the trees are being watered. Now, if you'll remember, the boys that were named besides Earl Walkup were Miles and James Rourke. Their father, underlined in red in the lower image, is E.L. Rourke. And the boys that are circled are M for Miles and J for James Rourke, his sons. So again, did she not, the lady, the witness, not be able to positively ID? Or are there influential parents that were able to stop any kind of proceedings? That's something that we do not know, but it certainly makes the case somewhat questionable. This last image that I have in this story is the image of Roy Hislop's gravestone that is located out at the Old Woodlawn Cemetery here at Pipestone. Again, not all the stories that we know of murder and mayhem from Pipestone County. I also talked about the story that we like to call the murder at the well, which happened in July of 1893. Now, the first thing we need to clarify is when I talk well in this case, I'm not talking about like the brick-walled well with the pulley system that you lower down to get the bucket of water. This is more like a low spot in the ground where water comes bubbling up, a spring, if you will. And this story happened in Section 7 of Elmer Township, which you see on the plat map, and you can see down in the lower part, the grade area, is the community of Trotsky. So we're just outside the community of Trotsky in this story. What happened is that a man by the name of John Nath was cleaning out this spring, this well, so to speak. And while cleaning it out, he uncovered a boot. And according to the newspaper, in the boot was a foot, or what remained of a foot. He went to Trotsky and he alerted the authorities, and by the time the authorities arrived from Pipestone to the scene, so had multiple looky-loos to observe what was going on. And as they continued to dig, they uncovered the skeletal remains of a human that had been doubled over and put in this low-lying spring, and the skull had 2 bullet holes in it. So they impaneled the jury, and clearly they have decided that this is a case of murder. They believe it's murder. They asked Mr. Nath, and Mr. Nath reveals that, well, he's just leased the land this year, and it's owned by Mr. Pedersen. So they leave the remains at the scene on a Friday afternoon, and they call for an inquest on Monday morning. Could you imagine that today, forensics and leaving a crime scene for all the looky-loos and people to have access to? On Monday morning, Mr. Pedersen was questioned. Mr. Pedersen remembered that 2 years earlier, he had hired 2 young men to break land in Section 7 of Elmer Township. And partway through the season, one of the young men disappeared, but his buddy gave the story that he had gotten homesick and he'd returned to Iowa. Nobody questioned it. At the end of the season, he paid off the one young man, and that was the end of the story. Now, Mr. Pedersen, upon questioning, recalled a little bit more information. He recalled a couple of names. The two young men went by the names of Terpstra and Aldrink, although he didn't remember first names. And he remembered that, yeah, they were from Iowa. He thought maybe Sioux City. Authorities reached out to authorities at Sioux City, and they found the parents of Mr. Aldrink. And the plot grew thicker, because in talking to the Aldrinks, it was learned that their son had never returned home the middle of that season 2 years prior. In fact, he had never returned home at all, and they'd been looking for him for 2.5 years. And at the end of that season, his buddy, Mr. Terpstra, had actually come to their home and told them that their son had gone on to St. Paul to find employment. It was presumed, based on that story that Mr. Pedersen told, that the victim was none other than Aldrink, and the likely murderer was Mr. Terpstra. But authorities didn't find any of the Terpstra family in Sioux City, and they didn't know where else to look. So if that's really what happened, he got away with it, because they never pursued it any farther. Nobody knows for sure if those remains were Aldrink, and nobody knows for sure if Mr. Terpstra was the murderer. As a matter of fact, there's something else we don't know. We don't know where Mr. Aldrink's remains are. The closest cemetery would have been at Trotsky. There is no Aldrink buried at Trotsky. There is no one unknown buried at Trotsky. The closest place where there might be somebody buried would be at Potter's Field. This is an image of Potter's Field, located in the northwest corner of the Pipestone Cemetery, Old Woodlawn Cemetery. The city does not have records of the names of the individuals buried in this section of the cemetery. It was reserved for the poor, for the unknown. So it is possible he's there. It's also possible that if the family believed those remains were their son, that they came and claimed the remains and he was buried in Sioux City. We simply do not know where he was buried. And I have one final story, not murder this time, but mayhem. Some of you may remember this event happening. Case number 4 is a grave robbery that happened at the Holland Cemetery in the fall of 1959. Young Jean Pencil, 11 years old, died of leukemia. This is her gravestone. Her family went out to the cemetery about 3 weeks later and noticed that the grave seemed to be disturbed, so they alerted the authorities. The authorities asked the public to provide any information they might have that would help them figure out what had happened. And the reports came in of a man seen around the cemetery at the time of the funeral. He was wearing work clothes. He was seen leaving in a battered red car. And then upon questioning and talking to citizens and people of the church, it led them to a suspect by the name of Willard Beckstrom. He had been hired to do work painting at the church. When he was questioned, he told authorities that he did not do it, but then later he told his father that yes, he had taken young Jean's body. The father turned him in to authorities. He had provided information on where he believed or where he had reburied Jean's body. She was located at that site. Her body was brought back to Holland. It was reinterred in the same site as she had previously been buried. When his case went to court, Mr. Beckstrom's father asked that his son not be sent to jail, but that his son be sent to a mental facility. And it was revealed that Mr. Beckstrom had spent time in a mental hospital when he was 18 years old, about 15 years prior to this. A psychiatric evaluation was ordered, and he was diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic. He was sentenced to the Yankton, South Dakota Mental Health Facility until a site could be found in a veterans facility. Instantly, when I read that, I thought, that meant if he was eligible to go to a veterans mental health facility, that he had served the country. Because he had spent time when he was 18 in 1944, my first thought was, well, perhaps he had served in the war and some type of events, post-traumatic stress disorder, might have led to this situation. I now highly doubt that first thought that I have. What I learned about him as a veteran was that he served 10 days with the Navy. He was stationed at the Great Lakes Naval Shipyard at the Great Lakes here in the States, 1 day on active duty, and then he was honorably discharged. His records are not within the government's 70+2 rule to release. So we can't access his personnel file or get information on his military service beyond what we know. We also don't have access to his records in like the Yankton Hospital. What we know about him is that he remained in according to his obituary, he remained in mental health facilities the rest of his life. He passed away in 2012, and that he is buried at the Hills of Rest Memorial Park in Sioux Falls beside his parents. And so that's what we know about Mr. Beckstrom. And so you can see the headlines. He was ordered insane and sent to the girl's grave, all of those things that help us know the facts that we know about these stories. So next week, Tuesday and Thursday, Tuesday at Stacy's Bar and Grill, Thursday at the Pipestone Country Club, we will be doing our final story of murder and mayhem. And just, spoiler alert for anybody that might be interested, it's the story of James Austin, known as the Candyman, that I will be sharing. But with that, those are some of the stories and how we know about them. We don't try to sensationalize the story. We don't try to make it up. We find the newspaper headlines and the obituaries and things that tell us what we know. So we can rest assured that people are people, right? And sometimes, even a long time ago, some not so nice things happen. So questions, comments. I know Carla has questioned me before, and I agree. There are certainly seeds for doubt that, they never suspected anybody else in Maggie's case. Perhaps Mr. Swenson committed suicide because the stress of being in jail and being accused, and perhaps somebody got away with it, much like the Aldrink Terpstra, if it was really Mr. Aldrink and Mr. Terpstra, but forensic science was not something they had access to, so there's no checking those kinds of DNA and dental records and things done to be 100% sure. So a lot of the information is speculative, but based on the newspaper accounts and records that we can find, this is the type of crimes that we believe happened in Pipestone County. Well, thanks for coming out.
Yeah.